Welcome to the CXO and CHRO Walk into a Bar, where we share insights at the intersection of talent and revenue. Dive into a unique narrative with our hosts, Michelle Strasburger, the insightful CHRO, and Dominique Sanfleur, the visionary CXO. Together, they bring dynamic perspectives that ignite thought-provoking dialogue from the C-suite. Each week, join us for electrifying sessions that confront the very challenges modern CXOs navigate in today's fast-paced business landscape. When split-second decisions loom, must it be talent or revenue that takes the hit? Or is there a harmonious crossroad where both can thrive? Can we blur the lines between talent and revenue? In every episode, we provide executive leaders with 3 strategic takeaways, transformative insights that will propel you to master the delicate balance between people and profit. It's not about winners or losers, but crafting an environment where everyone triumphs. Tune in and step closer to redefining executive success.
Hey,
Hey, we are here. It's Thursday.
it is
Already?
Thursday. It just creeps up week over week.
It creeps up. It's already like the end of September, too.
It is. The months kind of flew by pretty quickly. I feel like the year did, but the month certainly did.
Yeah,
Means we're busy.
for sure. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to the CXO and CHRO Walk into a Bar. I'm Michelle Strasburger. I'm the CEO of HR Rebooted, where we work with organizations, helping them understand the intersection of people and AI.
Absolutely. And I'm Dominic St. Fleur, CEO of Intramark. We built software in a process to help organizations get ahead of execution risk that come from people. Basically, a smoke detector to execution risk is, we call it VIBE, Valuable Insights for Better Execution.
And today we're talking about culture and managing culture across the subculture divide. So tell me what you think about that, Dom.
You know, this is a very relevant topic for, I feel like no matter the size of the organization, and organizations are increasingly global. 50-person organization could be spread across geographies. Certainly large multinationals, of course, spread across geographies. Of course, the bigger that you get, it's hard for an organization to just talk about culture as one monolith. There are subcultures within cultures and organizations. And so, the big question comes, what are those subcultures and how to unify an organization that has a bunch of subcultures into one unifying culture? And what does that look like? What are best practices? And the question that can kick us off is, I kind of touched on it a little bit, but what are some of the other things that causes subcultures, right? So geographic disbursement, clearly national cultures influence subcultures, right? You're a multinational company with many offices, you're going to have subcultures by virtue of having offices in different geographies. But let's say we're Acme Corp. We're solely based in the U.S. What would cause Acme Corp, based in the U.S. only, to have subcultures?
Yeah, I think growth, right? Just anything to do with growth. Like you start as this like startup, right? And you've got this core team, and you're all just like pouring your blood, sweat, and tears into it, and you're working together, and you've got this core culture, and then you start to grow, and it starts to divide, and you start with this like manager versus employee, and that's your subculture, right? The employee subculture versus manager, and then you start to create teams, and then now you've got team subcultures, and then you start to create divisions or locations, or you even have people that work in office versus people that work remotely. And you've got now subcultures of those. And it's interesting where you have those groups of people that think like the other has benefits that they don't have, right? Like the people that are in office are like, oh, they get to work from home. They get all these benefits that we don't get. And then the other people that are working from home are like, they get to be in office. Like they get all this information and they get all these benefits we don't get, because they're in office. And it's so funny how it's so disjointed, and they see the other as like the grass is greener. And then you can have, grow through acquisition or grow through, opening offices in other countries. And you can have subcultures. I have, or divestitures. I have a client who was part of a big organization and they divested. And so they have that kind of subculture of like being part of this big company, but now they're like a startup culture. And so they've got this other like overlayment of this other company, this old big company culture, but they're like starting to try to become this like small, agile culture. So it's I think growth or change can build some of those subcultures in your organization.
100%, Michelle. Like, you hit it on the head, right? An organization has these transition points where, it goes from startup culture to mid-size growth kind of culture, scrappy still, but, making a hard push for process, which is different from the early day startup culture where, multiple people wore different hats. And so now it's starting to, formalize. Then there's the maturity phase where, again, that takes sometimes even different type of leadership to guide one organization through those different stages. And of course, that leadership, the different leadership has different culture impacts or shaping. And of course, the culture that you had, when you're a X-person startup, with every new hire, you have a shift in culture. And so you get subcultures in addition to an overall changing of culture, right? So change in general, causes culture to change, but also subcultures to form, depending on how those changes happen. But you mentioned transactions, right? I think that carve out is a great example. I used to be a subculture of a larger organization. Now I'm the big culture of a independent organization that potentially is starting to form its own subcultures depending on how the organization evolves. So it's complicated, right? It's ever changing. It's super dynamic. And we touched on geographies, transactions, carve outs, M&A, that may cause certainly changes in culture, but creations of subculture. But even within the U.S. as growth happens, right? You have regional offices that can be different. Texas is going to be very different from the Pacific Northwest, and so as you're having offices in different locations in the in the U.S., you're going to create different subcultures, and as a representation of great values of different parts of the U.S. So it's like, how do you maintain that feel, consistency across all those geographies, subcultures, so on and so forth. And before I go too far, there's one organization I used to work for that did such an excellent job of having that consistent culture across countries, right? And so I found that to be, but we'll delve into that. But anything to add on that? Are there anything? Is there anything else?
What did they do?
So this was PwC. Where I started my career. I had the pleasure of working in the New York office, and then going to the Shanghai office. And it was everything from the office setup to how people worked and expectations and standards. And it was consistent. Obviously, different cultures, but expectations were the same. And even how some of the partners dressed were very similar between the two offices, right? Just kind of button-down shirt, casual, maybe a blazer sometimes, but the consistency across the brand was, at least for those two locations that I was exposed to, was quite consistent. And so one wonders, how do you drive? And interesting thing with the Big Four, they're actually independent firms. And so, no need to kind of get into that, but it's even an additional layer of complexity. So how do you coordinate not only brand identity across what are technically different organizations, but the consistency in culture. And so I think that's an interesting case study that could be studied by other organizations who are who are needing to manage subcultures. Is how do some of the big four manage that pretty effectively?
I also worked for an organization, and this is the only time that I've seen it. And as I moved away from that organization, I gained a greater and greater appreciation for it because I didn't see it again, where they were global as well. And they were very intentional about having a culture that was the same. So you could go to Dubai, you could go to Argentina, you could go to Boston, you could go to Canada, you could go to, Singapore, and the culture was absolutely the same, regardless of how in Sweden, how big or how small the office was. And it was because they were very intentional about their values and making sure those values were integrated into the organization. And they flew all new hires into the Swedish office for orientation. So that was a big cost, but they were very kind of, I'm going to say, religious about their culture and making sure that it was ingrained in everything they did. It was part of their performance management process. It was part of how they promoted people. It was part of how they interviewed people. It was part of all of their sales meetings. There was always a cultural component to that. It was part of onboarding. It was in everything they did. And when the executive team traveled, the CHRO traveled, and they would go and talk to people about the culture when they traveled. So it was always there. It wasn't just something that was on the wall. Of course it was on the wall. And in the Boston office where we were, we had the values on the wall, and then we had everybody stamp their hand on the wall, and then they signed it. And so they committed to those values. And so it was something that they were just always intentional about. And I think if you want to have a culture that is intentional, as you go through all those moments, you have to really think about, how are we going to change? How is this going to affect our culture? And how are we going to maintain the intentionality of our culture as we go through this shift, whatever it is, if it's a transaction, if it's growth, if it's even a reduction. And we didn't say that, but a reduction can create a subculture in an organization. A layoff, a shift in business strategy can change that as well. A major shift, not just an annual shift in business strategy, but a major shift in business strategy. We're not doing this anymore. We're doing something different, can change that. And so having that intentionality is something that Axis did extremely well. And I think they're still doing it extremely well today. They still get recognized for being a top employer. And so I think that's piece of it. And that's what sounds like PwC did as well, to keep that across the globe, not just across their offices in the US.
Absolutely. And what's coming out to me based on what you're saying is, one word that came to me was what Axis did as example, and what firms like PwC do, is systems, right? They build culture into their systems, and their systems drive that consistency across geographies, right? And so if you have they reinforce it. Exactly. Reinforce it is the best word there. If you have a different system for this geography and a different system for that one, and a different standard for this one, and different system and standard for that one, you're going to have problems, right? Driving consistency and visibility. And so for any organization, driving consistency and visibility, you got to build it into your systems. Culture has to be reinforced by your systems, and it can't be separate. And that's the only real way to get subcultures to align to a broader vision, broader culture, broader standard of consistency. There's another point you made draws a question, right? Which is, are subcultures necessarily a bad thing, right? I don't think we've said they are or not. Maybe we formalize that conversation. Are they a bad thing? Are subcultures bad? Are they great? Does it depend?
It depends. It
I
depends.
think the answer for most things in life.
Yeah, I can't make a blanket statement on that one.
Yeah, sure.
Subcultures can bring about very positive change in organizations, right? If you have a subculture that fosters, a sense of belonging in an organization, that's not great English. A lot of times, organizations have employee resource groups, and those can be considered a subculture, right? In an organization, maybe that's a stretch, but those are groups that bring people together, that have something in common, that can support each other, right? And those can bubble up and affect change in an organization. And those can be a very positive thing. And they can tell an organization, like, look, you're not doing this the right way. And here's what we think you can do to maybe foster a more inclusive environment in an organization. And I think subcultures can do that in an organization. But I think you have to be aware of what the subcultures are in your organization. And I think as you get bigger and bigger and you go through these transactions, and these subcultures exist, if you step away from them and you're not aware of them, that's where I think it can be bad for you as an organization. If you're aware of what they are and you're like, I'm okay with that as a subculture, we can live with that as a subculture, it's not that far of a drift from where we are. And it's actually beneficial, because in the plant, we want that kind of subculture because it fosters high energy, it fosters retention, those kinds of things. That's fine. But if you're not aware of what it is, and it's going to foster dissension, it's going to foster turnover, I think that's hard. I think, and as you get to become a bigger and bigger organization, a Fortune 500, thousands of employees, it gets so much harder to understand where those cracks are in the culture and where those subcultures are. And so leaning into listen is harder. And that's where I think, I give kudos to the CHRO at Axis for going out and talking to people and trying to understand, what is the culture in the US in this organization? What is the culture in Shanghai in this organization? And how do they feel it is in the organization? Because it can differ. Leadership drives culture, right? So leadership in different countries can drive culture. The political climate in that country can drive culture. The financial burdens of that country can drive culture. Other things happening in that country can drive culture, not just the organization or the leadership. So other things happening there can drive culture. So, using a tool like Vibe, and I think we've got a few minutes if you want to talk about like how you could use that to lean in and understand the culture and subcultures in your organization so that it's not a bad thing.
And I'm gonna piggyback it to you on how we marry Vibe with folks like you to, because Vibe as a process is super valuable, but it's advisors like you that would, help with the implementation for certain when cracks are identified, right? And extra bandwidth needs to kind of come in and ensure follow through. But you hit it on the head where you got to be aware of what the subculture is. Mm-hmm. And I don't think a lot, I think that's a missing opportunity for a lot of organizations is they know that these things are happening and subcultures exist, but they don't have visibility into what it is, right? And having a tool and a process like Vibe to turn on the lights, right? Vibe is a discovery process, right? And so depending on what the leader wants to know, we, create campaigns of prompts and motions to really get information from the organization in a way that, builds and maintains trust. But we take a unique approach to get that information accurately. And how this could be employed is, taking a Vibe approach, right, and start mapping out what are the different cultures within the organization, and basically applying the persona to each part of the organization when it comes to culture, and seeing how that maps together, and then based on how far they are from each other, there might be pretty much consistencies in most parts of the organization, but there might be an office, a division, whatever it may be, that's super far off, as an example, or a mixture. And so it's, from there, with that information, having that visibility, information's power, right? And knowledge is power. Now you can take steps, and we'll, help with the recommendations on what the organization needs to do to close that gap or bring that division, office, whatever it may be, back to, a culture that is more in line with what the organization wants to drive centrally. And with those recommendations, partners like you would jump in and help leaders implement those recommendations. Oftentimes leaders are super busy with, their day to day, but need to tackle these very important issues. And so having, especially an outside point of view, come in and help with implementation, especially, you've seen a lot of things at different organizations and best practices, and bringing that to bear, and coming up with recommendation. But to your point, it all starts with visibility. Do you have that visibility? Do you have a mechanism that can give you that visibility in a timely fashion, and continue to give you that visibility over time in a timely fashion, right? And I think that's where something like Vibe comes in. With that as well, just kind of touching on our subcultures, bad or good, depends, and it highly depends on what do you have visibility into them. But there's also an opportunity as well, and part of our process, could be that as well, where, there are best practices in subcultures that could be brought into the broader culture, right? There are things, an office, a division, a geography that they may be doing that you probably want to bring that up and start to make that part of broader culture as well. So there's definitely huge opportunities to do all sorts of things, but it starts with that visibility. So I think you hit it on the head there.
Yeah, I think so too. And what I like about Vibe too is I think that's important to have it over time and not just have it that one point in time, because somebody might be having a bad day or things might be great that day. And so you might not get a valid response from people. When you have it over time, you're actually getting much more insight into what it really is. So I think that's important, because you want to be listening over time, and really understanding what the culture is, not just today, but every day and over many days, to really understand. Because it's like our children, right? If you ask your child, like, how are you today? They're great, right? And how are you tomorrow? Like, they don't want to talk to you, especially if they're a teenager.
Very good analogy.
So, if you average it out, they like you over time, hopefully.
And God forbid you catch them on the day where, it seems like they don't like you, and then you base that on like their judgment. When it's don't
take it that, don't listen to that day.
Yeah.
You want to have good insights over a period of time to make a good judgment and to listen over time. But having that information is really helpful. Then you can really understand what's going on in your organization and really get a sense of what is the culture like, and where are our subcultures, and are those subcultures going to hurt us or help us? And maybe if you're thinking about, as an organization, like, we want to change our culture, having that understanding too of like, do we want to lean into some of those subcultures and let those subcultures drive the new culture of the organization? Because maybe that means it's time for a shift, right? If those subcultures are really emerging, that could be a sign that it's time to change and it's time for a shift in the culture.
100%, especially as to your point, an organization is going through transformation, inflection points, right? The leaders have to decide, when does culture need to shift? And it first starts with visibility on where does culture stand today? Where are the subcultures today? And are there things that we could leverage to make it shift in the right direction? And subcultures, can often serve as leading indicators of like, can something like this work in the future, right? If it's working in a particular geography, then that could be some validation that it could be tested elsewhere. So there's a lot of value in understanding subcultures, and there's just a lot of interesting things that you can do with that information that can drive clarity and growth for an organization.
The other thing we didn't talk about too with subcultures is generational shifts in generational subcultures.
That's a big one. That's a big one.
4 almost 5 generations in the workplace, and so as older generations start to retire or they're in leadership positions, right, and we have younger generations coming into the organization or more younger generations, like, does that warrant a cultural shift? So that that there will be subcultures created, or if not already created in the organization, because of the different generations. I'm not gonna talk about whether that's good or bad. I'm just gonna leave it at that.
You're not gonna plant a flag in the ground there. It's
my last one that it's neither good nor bad.
Well, I'm gonna put a stake on the ground. I think millennials are the best. No bias, of course, but I'm kidding. No, it's already here. I mean, I think just a generational, and I think that's an excellent point, right? Just a generational is an example of subcultures, forming, right? And trying to draw that consistency just generationally, right? Even if you're a company that has a location in just one office or one city, you still have some subculture divide to deal with, just from a generational perspective. And so I think that was a great one to mention as well.
Mm-hmm.
Adds complexity.
Yeah, it sure does. But it would be another great way to ask questions and get feedback and talk about how we need to, how could we support your generation? How could this culture, really be something that helps you thrive? Or how should we, shift the culture so you feel more supported in the organization?
100%, because, even from a generational standpoint, right? Not even just geography, but generational, right? Different benefits are going to be relevant for different groups. And then you layer in, geographical and all of that. It gets to, it is a complex system to manage, and having, again, that visibility is very, very key, especially as things shift. But, making sure that your systems drive consistency in culture, in a broader overarching culture framework, is going to be paramount, especially as subcultures, form and continue to evolve. Making sure that there's some consistency, that call it like that contract that you mentioned, or that poster that people sign, right? There's that standard that everybody, no matter what the geography is or situation is, ascribes to that one standard, even if they on a day-to-day are part of their subculture, but your systems have to continue to drive consistency at that standard level. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, our time is up. So this was a good conversation. Would love to hear feedback on how people are being intentional about their cultures during these shifts as well, or how they're managing the subdivide. Until next time.
Right, indeed.
Cheers.
You've just experienced another episode of The CXO and CHRO Walk into a Bar, where we share insights at the intersection of talent and revenue. Thank you for joining us. Please join us next week at noon Eastern for more strategic content to help you scale your business. You can follow us on LinkedIn and on YouTube for additional content or episodes you may have missed. The links will be in the comments section. If you'd like more information or to schedule time with Michelle or Dominique, follow the link in the comments section to book time on their calendar. Until next week, cheers.